start out, if you would state your name and spell it, just for identification.
Craig Robinson, C-R-A-I-G-R-O-B-I-N-S-O-N.
Okay, I was curious, in 1968, I know that you came to this area through the VISTA program. Why this area, and where did you come to start?
Well, actually, I was interested in I became interested in West Virginia in college because some coal miners from eastern Kentucky came to our college to talk about their problems with their health benefits. A lot of miners were losing benefits in those days because mines were shutting down, and a lot of mines were becoming non-union. And so there were some major strikes going on, and some of the people that were involved in those strikes came to our college to talk to students about what they were doing. And I got really interested, and I hitchhiked down into Kentucky and a little bit of West Virginia just to meet with people. And so I had that interest from college, and then when I joined the VISTA program about a year and a half later, I asked to be sent to either Kentucky or West Virginia. And they said there was a project here, and that's how I landed here.
So what was the original project?
Well, it was actually it was a mental health project, technically, but they asked us to get involved in any kind of health issue that we could find in the communities that we were placed in. And I actually started working in coal camps in southern Raleigh County on what's called the Gulf there, and worked on with some people on getting water into their part of the coal camp. And I got to know a lot of disabled miners who were living there and their families, and I learned about silicosis and this lung disease that seemed to be everywhere, that a lot of disabled miners were suffering from and couldn't get compensation for because it wasn't compensable. So that's how I got involved in looking into the black lung issue and making contacts with miners who were suffering from the problem.
Now, in one of the books it mentions that you were reading a lot about.
Just 1 second.
That was Fireco. Was the name of the coal camp that I first began working in was Fireco.
Do you remember
on
the
the
first
Gulf.
day that you got there? What your reaction was to the camp?
Well, what was striking, of course, was in this case is that first there was a black part of the camp and a white part of the camp, and it turned out that the black part of the camp was the one that didn't have running water, and so what the community was interested in was in getting water brought over from the other side of the camp or the other side of the railroad, actually, and so it was striking in I guess the fact that they had these two ethnic groups that were separated, but although separated in terms of housing, but in terms of work and in terms of kind of even social relationships, there was a lot of interaction. And the fact that people didn't have running water, it was just very striking. People having to carry water from a couple miles up the road, go to a spring and get all their water for washing and drinking, and it was obviously it was a major change from what I'd been used to, and it was kind of a shock. And then it was also striking to me, though, the sense of community that was there and how fairly easy it was for people to get together to take some action. And people decided to go at risk for loans in order to get the money to get the pipe, to lay the pipe, to get the water over to their side of the holler. So I was struck by the tough situations that people were living in, and then their sense of community and their willingness to take me in, for example, was kind of was very striking to me. And I became a part of people's families and had meals with them daily as we were working on this project, and I heard their stories about their life in the mines and on the railroads, and how the industry had changed over time.
Now, when did you actually get involved with the movement to win Black London?
Well, it was shortly after that experience and working with that community, I began doing research on black lung as a problem, trying to get the medical information that was available and understand what it was that was in the law, how the law was structured in a way that didn't allow people to get compensation for the disease. And so I made contact with doctors and attorneys and read what was available. And there was, and there had been activity in England, for example. There had been activity in Pennsylvania about this issue. And so there was material you could get. And there were doctors who were active in looking at the problem too, even in Beckley. Dr. Donald Rasmussen and Dr. Hawley Wells actually did research on the disease, and they were local and they were willing to talk about it. I then was helped to bring together coal miners and disabled miners to actually talk about the issues, talk about what it was medically that was going on, and talk about what some of the legal questions were. So we had these kind of small group meetings, a number of those, to kind of explore in some depth what their personal issues had been, and then what that meant in terms of the law, what kind of changes in the law would be needed in order to get compensation, and what kind of and just to better get a sense of the medical aspect of the problem as well. So it was those small group meetings where we brought in a doctor to talk about it, or a lawyer to talk about it as well with the miners, where I began to really understand what was happening, and I think the miners did too. Began to get a better sense of, well, here's a direction that we could go to make some changes, and it's going to require legislative change. And I think we have to remember, this was a time when there was a lot of social and political ferment in the country. Civil rights movement was right in front of us and had been for a while. There was a lot of student activism around the war. And so the idea of people getting together to make a change or to improve their situation and to put pressure on the government to make positive changes, that was an idea that people understood and that people really were ready for, I think.
Now, when I talked to Mr. Hall yesterday, he was talking about the bitterness, like on the picket lines. And was there a lot of anger and excitement? Did you ever wonder what I got in the middle of?
Well, you know, for somebody coming from the outside, it really, another striking thing is the solidarity of coal miners and their families. And it's a solidarity that I think comes from the union, but also just comes from the nature of the work. It's like kind of being on the battlefield, I think. And so, what was striking to me was this sense of kind of we're all in it together, and that we have a common enemy. And that was something that I hadn't ever witnessed before either. It wasn't so much the bitterness that I saw as this sense of solidarity and togetherness. Although there certainly were times and stories that we heard about bitter strikes.
Now, you were talking about you started with small meetings in people's homes, and this was happening in different places. When did it start to come together?
Well, there was a legislative session in that January of 1968. State legislature was meeting. And so it was kind of in the time leading up to that legislative session and during that session that the mobilization or the movement came to a head. And as I mentioned, there were these small group meetings that were being held. And in some cases, local unions would have a meeting too and invite Dr. Rasmussen or Dr. Buff, who was a cardiologist in Charleston who had a lot of interest in this and was very forceful in presenting the problem to people. And so it wasn't just what I was involved in. There was other activity, some, as I said, local unions or other groups that were getting together. But before that session and during the session, we saw the potential for getting the word out to a lot of people, because we had these articulate, knowledgeable people. We had some miners, we had some legislators who were very good on it. Warren McGraw, for example, from Wyoming County. We had Dr. Rasmussen, Dr. Buff, and Dr. Wells, who were all very forceful and clear and good presenters. And so we organized with miners in various parts of southern West Virginia. We organized rallies and major gatherings, and that were advertised at bathhouses and in the newspaper, and invited all miners and family members and widows to come to learn about the problem and learn about what could be done about it in terms of legislation and political action.
Now, where would you hold the rallies? Can you tell me a little bit about them?
Well, they were held in schools, Park Junior High School in Beckley, or in Logan, a high school. Whitesville, there was a high school that was used. A community center near Welch. Just either community centers or schools usually were the sites.
Do you remember the first time you went to one of the meetings that the doctors were holding?
I'm not sure if I remember, if I do remember the first one, but I definitely remember rallies.
Can you tell me about them, what they were like?
Well, they were, actually they were pretty, the rallies that were held around the issue of black lung were pretty festive, actually, and they were fun, and they were high energy. People were fired up, and I think people had a sense that we were going to make a change here, and that by seeing everybody else coming together around the issue, I think there was a real optimism in a sense that something could happen. And the speakers were entertaining. Dr. Buff was fiery. He was kind of a John L. Lewis-like character, and did a great job of talking about the plight of the coal miner and this health problem. Dr. Rasmussen was more academic, but he conveyed a lot of a real sense that he knew what he was talking about and that he was authoritative. And sometimes local politicians were there, and they kind of got into the feel of it and gave good talks. And so they were really upbeat, kind of festive, fun, and people came out of it, I think, ready to do something.
Did you get media attention? Oh.
You got something?
Okay, I was asking, did you begin to get media attention once the rallies became more numerous and more people started attending?
Yes, we did, and there was a focus on to try to get to the media, actually, on the part of some of the doctors and ourselves. I mean, we wrote articles for local newspapers, but we also invited in outside and national media. The New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, ABC, and they began to cover these rallies, in Logan and Welch, and that added, I must say, to the sense that something important was happening here, and that what was being said was being recognized around, beyond just the room that it was being said in.
Did the movement gain momentum after the Farmington disaster in November of 1968?
The Farmington disaster was important, was actually a precursor to the black lung movement, I would say, and was important in developing a consciousness among miners that there was serious health and safety problems that weren't being dealt with. And it also prepared the country, it sensitized the country to to the problem of coal miners, health and safety. If you remember, the Farmington disaster was really, even though there was a gas ignition that started the explosion, it was the fact that there was coal dust throughout that mine that caused the extensive explosion that rolled through that Farmington number 9 mine. So the coal dust in Farmington was related to the coal dust that was causing the lung disease. It was both caused by the increased mechanization in the mines and was part and parcel the same issue, really.
So Farmington kind of caught the attention of the rest of
I think it prepared the country to be aware of what coal miners were doing. It prepared coal miners. It brought coal miners. It was provided a focus for miners themselves to begin to look more critically at at the work that they were involved in and the dangers, and the fact that they might be able to do something about it. I mean, people knew that they were in dangerous situations, but the sense that they could do something about it, and that there was kind of a common feeling that we could do something about it, maybe, was started with that Farmington disaster, I think.
Was there a feeling after that of, we've had enough? You know, something's got to change?
Yeah, I think that there was definitely a sense that we need to, that we can take action, we can make a change, we deserve a change, and that we are in a position where we can make that without maybe threatening our whole livelihood or something. I mean, the industry was fairly strong at that time, and people, I think, had a sense of some basic security that they could take some action without it destroying their livelihood.
The black lung benefits issue seems like an issue that the union should have or would have dealt with. Did they support it in the beginning?
Well, in the late 60s, we were coming off of a long period where the union and the coal industry had been more collaborators than antagonists. And so the union was, strangely enough, was not in the forefront of the battle to get black lung benefits, because I think they were still in this mode of collaborating with the coal industry to help the coal industry and to create a strong coal industry that would be competitive with oil and nuclear and these other threats that were felt to be there in the past. So, but for a number of reasons, the union was not in the forefront, and they discouraged miners from getting involved in, say, the Black Lung Association. They claimed that it could be dual unionism, or that it was not in accord with union policy, and that the union had their own lobbyists, and so just take it easy and we can take care of this. But at the local level, people didn't feel that way. I mean, people felt like they had to do it on their own, and so the real initiative came from at the local union level for the initiative for change and for direct involvement. This really took the union hierarchy by surprise, I think. They didn't realize the extent of the feeling about it, and they didn't realize the capacity of the local miners to take action.
When did you start actually publishing the Black Lung Bulletins? Do you remember?
Well, I might go back to this legislative session, because I think that there wasn't as we were discussing earlier, the movement kind of came to a head during that legislative session, and it appeared as though the legislature was not going to act on a couple of bills that were prepared by the Black Lung Association and by these small groups and some attorneys that we worked with. It didn't look like they were going to be acted on. They were just kind of, the committees were not allowing them out. And so and coal miners were made aware of that through these rallies and public pronouncements. And so there was toward the end of that session, there was a statewide, there was a strike that started in southern West Virginia that spread throughout the state and shut down most of all of the state of West Virginia's coal industry. So there were 40,000 miners that were out on strike, maybe for the first time it was a strike against the legislature, or a strike to get the legislature to act and the governor to sign a bill. And so that was a rare event in American history, let alone West Virginia history. And it was also kind of amazing, you could look at it as a kind of an amazing public health movement, actually, involving the people that were suffering from the problem. So there were 40,000 miners out, and the legislature then decided that yes, we will consider this bill. And they held hearings, and that were attended by a lot of miners, and allowed these doctors to speak who were experts, and the coal industry, of course, brought in their people as well. Legislation, and there was a lot of back and forth and behind the scenes negotiating, but a bill eventually did come out that recognized coal workers' pneumoconiosis as a occupational disease that was compensable. And it defined some of the, it addressed some of the issues around defining how you determine whether a person has the disease and whether they're disabled. It wasn't a perfect law from our point of view, but it definitely was a huge step. And so then once that bill was passed, and then the governor, and then the miners stayed out until the governor agreed to sign it, and then they went back to work after the bill was signed. We were pretty pleased that we thought we had won a big victory, and that miners had won a big victory, and they had, but there were a lot of miners who were already disabled from the disease, and this bill was just going to address people that were presently working. So we still had a huge problem of miners who were disabled, widows of miners who had died from black lung disease that hadn't been addressed. And we also had safety conditions that the Farmington mine disaster exposed, and other disasters as well. One of the battle cries during that legislative session, by the way, was 78-4. There were buttons that said 78-4, and that referred to the 78 miners that died at Mannington, and 4 miners that died at Hominy Falls. There was even during the black lung movement, there was a recognition that we had a health and safety prevention problem here. We had a health and safety regulation and law problem, in addition to the compensation problem. So right after that, though, right after that legislative victory, the issue then went to Congress, and Congress acted. Ken Heckler was very important, a congressman from West Virginia, in leading the way and really pushing, spearheading spearheading the movement in Congress to get the 1969 Coal Mine Health and Safety Act passed, which included compensation for people who had been previously disabled from black lung disease and widows of coal miners who had died from black lung disease. So the action of West Virginia coal miners directly led, I think, to the 1969 Health and Safety Act, which led to the black lung provisions in that bill, and black lung clinics as well. There was a provision for establishing black lung clinic programs, which we're running one of those at the New River Family Health Center now, and have for the last 20 years. But that was one outcome, was the federal act. The other was that coal miners who were involved in the black lung movement and in pushing for the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act began to look at their own union and organized with, and began to organize to reform their union so that it would be more responsive to these health and safety concerns as well as to all the other myriad concerns that coal miners had.
Looking at the law, I'm curious about the concept of presumption. Can you kind of explain that and how it came about that it was put into the law?
Well, yeah, one of the major issues actually and bones of contention during that legislative session was what's the definition of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, and how do you determine whether somebody really has it, whether their disability is caused by the coal dust and not through smoking or something else. And it turns out that the epidemiology of it, or when you look at populations of coal miners, you can see this remarkably higher incidence, prevalence of lung disease and death due to lung disease. So we knew that their exposure in their occupation was related to their disabilities. And some of the other studies that Dr. Donald Rasmussen was doing, where he was looking at blood gas studies of coal miners and linking the results of those to time in the mines, and the work done by pathologists and looking at lung sections and tissues. I mean, it was all fairly clear that there was a relationship between coal dust and disability, a strong relationship. But for an individual miner, it can be hard to determine that, well, was it that 5 years or 10 years of smoking that might have been related, or was it some other exposure or something else? And so there had to be a presumption in favor of the miner that if they had exposure of a certain amount, that any resulting disease was caused by the coal dust, unless they could prove otherwise. So put the burden of proof on the other side to prove that it wasn't the coal dust. That was what was important. Because if the presumption was against the miner, and the miner had to prove in every case that, yeah, it was the coal dust that caused the disease, it would be an impossible burden in most cases to overcome. So the presumption, where the burden of proof was a critical issue in really whether you could get benefits or not. And there was a presumption that was in that state legislation that was passed. It wasn't as strong as we'd like, but it was definitely a good start.
Did you get everything you fought for, or most of it, in the Health and Safety Act of 1969?
Well, that again, I mean, there was all the safety issues, and they were important. The coal dust standards were strong. It turns out that in the long term, the problem with coal dust standards was actually compliance, obtaining compliance and testing, and having accurate testing done of the dust levels. And that's still an issue that we're dealing with. But yeah, there was an awful lot accomplished with that law. Now it turns out though that even the federal law had a lot of issues related to how that presumption was going to work, and how people were going to be determined to be whether they were disabled from black lung. And the way the regulations were constructed initially were very restrictive and made it very hard for people to prove their eligibility for those benefits. So the Black Lung Association continued in existence, and in fact even became more established, more structured, and continued the battle, because they not over the legislation, but over the regulations. And there were actually amendments then 3 years later that liberalized the eligibility requirements and the presumption features of that law, and made it possible for a lot more people to become eligible for benefits. And that in large part was due to the Black Lung Association, the coal miners that were involved in the Black Lung Association in their lobbying efforts. And they produced black lung bulletins, and they produced They had meetings, they had chapters, black lung chapters that were developed throughout the coal fields. And there was a lot of grassroots work done that led to those improvements in 1973.
Where did the...
Okay. We have to change tape.
This one question just popped into my head. So, the Black Lung Associations and the Black Lung Bulletins, where was the funding coming from to pay for all this?
Well, there were dues that were paid by miners into the Black Lung Association, so that was one source. But there was also some Office of Economic Opportunity monies that were used for providing benefits counseling and for some of the office expenses related to some of that work with the Black Lung program.
I thought maybe miners were donating at the rallies.
Well, there were donations, but there was also some grant monies that were used at that time for some of the education that was going on in benefits counseling.
You started to talk about this, and then I was thinking about the law. Can you tell me a little bit about the changes in the union after the 1968, 1969 strikes?
Well, as I mentioned, a number of the people that were active in the Black Lung Association and the Black Lung movement became involved, were interested in reforming their union and became involved in that. And there was actually then Jock Yablonsky was formerly the district president from District 5 in Pennsylvania, who was a member of the kind of the establishment within the union, decided to run for president against the then incumbent president Tony Boyle on a reform ticket. And Mr. Yablonsky came to West Virginia and met with leaders of the Black Lung Association to get there to see if they would support him, and they did. They decided that this was a reasonable way to try to reform the union, and they supported him. And then, as you're probably aware, Mr. Yablonsky and his wife and daughter were murdered in their home shortly after the election, actually, that Yablonsky lost. But there had been a lot of irregularities, and it was pretty well understood that the Labor Department was going to step in, and probably there'd be another election. So there was still a lot of concern, apparently, on the part of the union establishment about his challenge. So he was murdered, and then the miners who had been active in West Virginia and around the country for reform and supported Mr. Yablonsky formed the Miners for Democracy in order to continue the effort. And the Miners for Democracy then chose Arnold Miller, who was the president of the West Virginia Black Lung Association, to be the candidate for president and to run against the established president of the union. And Arnold Miller then did win. So Arnold Miller came out of the West Virginia Black Lung Association. He became the vehicle for the reform in the union, and so that was another direct outcome of the Black Lung movement in the state.
So it seems like, just from what I've been reading, it seems like there has been some back and forth in the law that would ease requirements and then make them. Can you kind of take me through those? I know you said there were amendments in 72 to the 69 law. Can you tell me some of the changes?
Well, yeah, there's been a constant kind of struggle on the part of miners and the regulatory agencies that are handling the Black Lung program over the issue of eligibility standards and definitions of disability. And the 1973 amendments brought major changes in eligibility requirements, allowing a lot more coal miners to become eligible for benefits. Then subsequently to that, subsequently things were tightened down again, And at the present time, there's a struggle on the part of the Black Lung Associations around the country to change the rules so that the regulations are more fair for coal miners. It's very difficult now to establish eligibility for black lung benefits.
What is the difficulty? What?
Actually, I'm not as close as I had been to this issue, but it's around the issue of the definition of what the medical definition of what is what medical evidence constitutes total disability, and what evidence is allowed, and what the standards are in terms of the breathing tests and the X-ray evidence. So it's a technical area that, but decisions about how they interpret the medical evidence is critical to whether people can become eligible or not.
If you were going to just give me a paragraph that described your role in the Black Lung Movement, what would it say?
Well, I guess that my role in the Black Lung Movement was as an educator and an organizer and a network builder. I helped to bring coal miners together to talk about the problem. I helped to bring information that was out there to people who were suffering from the problem and who were interested in making changes. And I helped to bring experts into contact with the miners themselves so that they could mutually educate each other. So that was my role, but I was one of the people that did those kinds of things, and there were others. The movement was definitely not one that was either caused by Vista volunteers or that Vista volunteers were chiefly responsible for. We played a helpful role, but it was mainly the coal miners themselves that took this on and carried it through and made it a success.
This, I'm just kind of curious myself. It seems like a lot of things came together, the militant era and the sense of the community which we've lost. Do you think this could have happened now? If you tried to do this now, would you get the same kind of support?
I think it was a peculiar historical situation that allowed this to happen, and I would be doubtful if it could be repeated now. But I think that it was the nature of the industry at the time. It was, the social and political situation in the country. It was the mining disasters that took place. It was an openness on the part of the media to this issue. There were a lot of things that might be hard to replicate now.
Another thing that I've noticed is a lot of the central people, Dr. Rasmussen, Rick Banks, yourself, Ken Heckler, were people who were not from here. What was it about this issue that captured the imagination of people to come and fight for the miners in West Virginia?
Well, I think that, as I say, we were all a part of an historical moment where a lot of us felt our personal value was tied into whether we could be effective at improving people's lot, or improving people who were improving the situation of people who were in trouble. I mean, that was important in those days, and it was important for our own sense of being a good person, I guess. That was part of it. another part of it was it was exciting as hell, and it was fun, and it was really thrilling to be a part of something like that. And I think we all felt like this was something important, and that it was an honor to be a part of it.
It made a difference.
And we could participate in something that was making a difference. Yeah.
Is there anything that you feel like we should have talked about that we haven't talked about?
I don't think so.
I think so. Pete, is there
I wanted to
anything?
ask you if you could maybe address to Melody the 1990s, whether you feel the government has held up its side of the bargain with relationship to what the emphasis of the Mine Act. Has black lung been eliminated? Are the dangers still there, or have there been improvements that you've seen, that you recognize?
I don't. Well, I'm not. I'm not really. I'm not an expert on that at this point, but. I think that, well, one of the things that's happened in the 80s and 90s has been yet another ratcheting up in the mechanization of the mining industry. And you know, in the 60s, the industry had just gone through a mechanization from hand loading to continuous miner operators, and there had been a decline in the number of miners, but an increase in wages, and there was a kind of a stabilization at the end of the 60s, you know, and we had 40,000 miners in the state, or over 40,000 miners. At this time, we're still producing the same amount of coal in West Virginia. We have about 20,000 miners, or less than 20,000 miners. And a lot of those are non-union now. So the collective power of the miners is not what it was in the late 60s. And as a result, I think there's more difficulty in obtaining recognition on the part of lawmakers and the public. And I think, and we've also seen very dramatic evidence that the promise that was in the 1969 Act to reduce dust levels and therefore eliminate the disease has not been fulfilled. There's still a lot of dust for those miners that are working underground, and even some that are working on the surface. A lot of dust exposure, and a lot of lung disease is still showing up in our black lung clinic and in other people that are testing miners. So there's a long way to go, and I think that the present administration is making some important changes in how dust is going to be monitored, and taking it out of the hands of the miners and putting it, you know, into the hands of regulators. I think that'll be a major step, but we have yet to see what the benefit's going to be. But it seems like that's a positive step. So we have a long way to go. We also have maybe a more difficult way to go, given the changing nature of the industry and the much increased mechanization and conversion to more surface mining and reduction in the percentage of miners that are organized in unions.
I'm curious, there seems to be sort of a feeling that there's always going to be dust and there's always going to be dust disease, but aren't there other countries that have a much better record of doing away with that? I think I did an interview with a lady from Australia that said they had almost done away with it, gotten the levels low enough that it wasn't happening.
I'm sorry, Melody, I'm not up on that. I mean, I knew in the past that Germany and England had done a pretty good job, you know, but I'm not sure about what's going on now.
Okay, that's great. Thomas?
Um,
And if you could just prep.
yeah, I mean, I could. There's like to maybe say a couple of things about that.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, actually the movement to address coal miners' security related to disability and health, that there was a major move to address that problem at the end after the Second World War in 1947. There was a series of major national coal strikes that John L. Lewis led to the founding of the UMWA Health and Retirement Funds that provided for the first time comprehensive health benefits and retirement benefits for miners, including disabled miners. And that was actually a model program. It led to the development of the 9 Appalachian regional hospitals, and 50 clinics were built from Pennsylvania to Alabama throughout the coal fields that were, whose job it was to address coal miners' health problems. And the retirement fund addressed the issue of providing some retirement security if a person was to become disabled or retired from the industry. And then, so there was that great flurry of activity. Actually, and there was another disaster, the Centralia mine disaster, that kind of stimulated that helped to bring about the public support of that health and retirement funds. And so it was then, there was this 20-year period then where there was kind of not much action in the coal fields around the issues of disability. And it was then again, 20 years later, in the end of the 60s, that the Black Lung Movement came around to begin to address again the issues that were still left on the table, particularly the issue of lung disease and payments for people that became disabled.
When you came here, the disabled miners that you met at Fireco, the ones who couldn't work because their lung disease was so bad, were they getting any type of benefits to live off of?
Well, they may have had their miner's pension, but that would have been in Social Security. But those miners' pensions were pretty skimpy in those days, and so it wasn't much. They didn't have other disability payments, no.
What did the older miners call, before they knew pneumoconiosis, did they have a term that they called that disease?
Well, silicosis was used a lot because they had been told by doctors and others that anytime they had lung disease, it had to be rock dust that had caused the problem. It couldn't have been coal dust. And so they used it, and the Workers' Compensation Board recognized silicosis, although it was hard to prove that it was silicosis, because then if they said, well, it's coal dust that's causing your problem, and that's not a compensable disease. So, or miner's asthma was another term that was used by doctors in the coal fields. And emphysema, bronchitis, so they were throwing around, there were these diagnoses that could apply to people that got lung disease from any number of causes that were being used, and that kind of blurred the issue.
Great.
So